90 Day Fiancé Season 11 has 7 couples, but something about Greg Chilik and Joan Kruchov makes fans curious as they wonder if the pair stayed together and made their relationship work. Greg, from Long Island, is one of the 8 American cast members in the season who's found love in a different part of the world and decided to bring them home on a K-1 visa. Joan is an NGO director from Kampala, Uganda. Greg and Joan were in a long-distance relationship for 4 years before Joan could join in America on 90 Day Fiancé. Greg is already receiving backlash from fans who have been ridiculing his life choices. Greg is especially disliked for not having a plan and then being a mama's boy who's been compared to 90 Day Fiancé icon Colt Johnson. Joan flew to the US in episode 2 with hopes and dreams after throwing away her life in Uganda, where she could have thrived without Greg and not have to deal with Greg's mother tracking how many times Joan took hot showers. Well, Joan dumped Greg on 90 Day Fiancé to head back home. Greg met Joan because he fell asleep on a man's shoulder in a plane, and the man turned out to be from Uganda, East Africa. The man owned a safari company, and after talking to him for 6.5 hours straight, he ended up inviting Greg to Uganda. Greg checked into his guest house and saw Joan within the first hour and a half of being in Uganda. They chatted a little bit, and Greg even told her about his weight loss journey. A year later, Greg was still thinking about her. Like, damn, I let that girl get away, you know? Still to this day, Greg is not sure how Joan found her on social media. He was thinking of her, and suddenly he'd received a friend request. I could not believe it, Greg continued. Things just took off from there as they started chatting on WhatsApp. Greg ended up going back to Uganda, and he proposed to her on her birthday. 90 Day Fiancé's Greg and Joan encountered challenges due to their starkly different backgrounds, including Greg's living situation with his mother and his financial instability, in contrast to Joan's career as an NGO director. Greg lived with his mother on Long Island, New York, and Joan was initially hesitant about living with them, preferring to have her own space for privacy. Greg's baking career wasn't a successful one, and Joan found out he had rejected a state job offer. Joan was skeptical about Greg's mother, Lucille, and the rules she enforced, such as not sharing a bed with Greg. Despite Joan wondering if coming to the US was the right decision for her, considering she craved a spouse with financial stability and a place of his own, she and Greg are still together after 90 Day Fiancé, which also means they got married too. 90 Day Fiancé _ Alexa reposted some of Greg's recent Instagram stories where Greg is showing his love for his partner through a quote and a different picture showing Joan's hand placed on his with her wearing a large diamond ring on her ring finger, revealing their current relationship status. Joan Kruchov from 90 Day Fiancé has quickly earned the title of the season's biggest villain, thanks to the gradual reveal of her darker side on camera. Hailing from Kampala, Uganda, Joan met Greg while he was vacationing there. Greg had traveled to Uganda on a whim after striking up a conversation with a fellow passenger on a flight, who happened to own a travel business in the country and encouraged him to visit. Greg later met Joan at the place he was staying, and while they initially connected, they fell out of contact for over a year. Greg met Joan within the first 30 minutes of arriving in Uganda, and they quickly bonded, especially after Greg opened up about his weight loss journey. What stood out, however, was how Joan managed to find him on Facebook and sent him a friend request a full year later, seemingly out of the blue. Their online chats soon led to a long-distance relationship, and Greg eventually flew back to Uganda and proposed to her on her birthday. Now living in the US on a K-1 visa, Joan has repeatedly expressed regret about her decision to move and marry Greg. Joan wanted to alter the wedding dress she had brought with her from Uganda, but with Greg away at work, she had no one to drive her. She turned to Lucille for help, asking if she could take her to the bridal shop. Lucille, though caught off guard, agreed, saying, "You're going to be my daughter-in-law, so I need to help you." Joan didn't have a driver's license and had grown accustomed to Greg driving her around. However, her request came at an inconvenient time, interrupting Lucille's cooking, adding subtle tension to the moment. "I'm looking forward to see Joan getting fitted in her wedding gown." Lucille was excited to see Joan in her wedding dress and saw it as a special moment that could bring them closer. She hoped the experience would be a bonding opportunity and tried to make small talk during the drive. Eventually, Lucille asked if Joan wanted her to come inside and help. "I'd love to, but I'm going to be talking to my family," Joan responded, politely but firmly. She explained that she wanted her family to be the first to see her in the dress, not wanting to hurt her sister's feelings by sharing the moment with someone else. "I must say it's hurtful." On the other hand, Lucille's feelings were clearly hurt. She admitted to the cameras that she had been expecting to go into the bridal shop with Joan and felt blindsided when Joan told her she didn't need her. Despite her efforts to be supportive, Lucille was left feeling unappreciated. She confessed that Joan's dismissal made her feel rejected and just worthless, especially since she genuinely believed she could be there for her future daughter-in-law. As expected, Joan didn't offer an apology, leaving Lucille to silently cope with the sting of being excluded from a moment she had hoped to share. Greg was expected to pay a traditional bride price to Joan's family before marrying her, a significant cultural requirement. Joan requested that he buy 15 cows, with each cow costing around 1.5 million Ugandan shillings, or approximately $200. That meant Greg would need to spend about $3,000 in total. Joan explained to producers that if Greg refused to pay the dowry, it would be seen as a sign of disrespect to her family and a betrayal of her late father's final wishes. "We can't get married," she said, fully aware that Greg was financially struggling and couldn't easily afford the dowry. Joan also began pressuring Greg to move into their own apartment. She had originally planned to stay at his mother's house for just 3 to 6 months, but ended up staying longer due to Greg's financial struggles. Having viewed America as a land of opportunities, Joan felt increasingly disappointed. She urged Greg to man up and find a way to pay her dowry and secure a new place to live. Desperate for privacy, Joan didn't hesitate to ask Greg's mother to leave her own home so she and Greg could have the space to themselves. Greg was already struggling financially, with $8,000 in debt and the added burden of repeated trips to Uganda. While the show suggested Joan had a better quality of life in Uganda, viewers never saw that firsthand. She appeared to give up her career to move to the US, but did she ignore Greg's red flags, including his joblessness and the fact that he still lived with his mother? 90 Day Fiancé star David Toborowsky has been silently dealing with a health condition while revealing that he's welcomed a second daughter, his soon-to-be daughter-in-law, after having a baby with Annie Soin. David and Annie's relationship started in Thailand in 90 Day Fiancé Season 5. David being 24 years older than Annie wasn't a problem, but it did affect their decision to have kids. David had gotten a vasectomy and didn't want to become a dad when he was nearly 60. He started focusing on his health and losing weight once he was ready to become a father to Annie's kids. David recently admitted to having kept a secret about his health from fans. David took to Instagram to share a video of him cutting grass with shears. He joked as he compared the situation to how he had not been intimate with Annie for 18 months and didn't know what to expect once he did. Annie laughed in the background while filming her husband. In his caption, which was more serious, David wrote that he had tried to help Annie with the grass earlier but added, "You have to understand that I hurt my back while I was back in the US." He continued, "My fault, but I am tired anyway." David returned to the US for a short visit after spending several months living in Thailand with Annie. The couple had traveled there around November 2024, as Annie wanted to be close to her family for the birth of their baby. David respected her wish and made the move, even though he had recently started a new real estate job in America. His decision to relocate showed his deep support for Annie. When David briefly returned to Arizona, he mentioned it was for work, but his heart clearly remained with his growing family in Thailand. As David counted down the days to reunite with his wife and baby, he kept his pain hidden from his followers. Although he may still struggle with whatever he's going through, he continues to put on a strong front. He doesn't want Annie to worry or his child to see their father in pain. David has also been focusing on his appearance, wanting to look like a dad, not a grandfather. After long travels, including over 24 hours to get to Thailand, fatigue sometimes catches up with him, but he keeps pushing forward. David likely chose not to tell Annie about hurting his back while he was in the US because he didn't want to worry her from afar. Posting about it on social media would have meant she'd find out, so he may have waited to tell her in person after arriving in Thailand. Thankfully, the injury doesn't seem too serious. He's been seen bending down and trimming grass with shears. It even seems like his condition has improved recently. Whether the 90-day fiancé star decides to share more details remains to be seen.